Anyway.
Yeah, no, you're very passionate about that, so we'll talk about, the reason behind that. So I'll just do a bit quick intro, yeah?
Sorry, this skill. Yeah, that one's good. That's a skill.
Yeah, those two. We don't have to look, we've been kind of looking at one another anyway. So, welcome to another Dawn podcast. And today we've got Weh Yeoh joining us to share with us his really interesting journey, especially in the not-for-profit sector, and his time spent in Cambodia and growing up here as an Australian-born Chinese. So, welcome to Dawn podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
No, thank you. So, tell before we launch into why you went to Cambodia, give the audience obviously a bit of background about yourself. We very much focus on inclusion, diversity, stories and voices of people that we don't often see on mainstream. So, I'd like to hear more about that. Why you see that there's a fit with what you do with what we do.
Sure. Yep. I mean, my story is probably not that dissimilar to a lot of other migrant children's stories. But my great-grandparents migrated from China to Malaysia during a time of famine. And then my parents moved from Malaysia to Australia to give their kids a better life. And growing up, I was really aware of this sacrifice and the fact that my parents came to this country with $200 in their back pocket and then slowly built themselves up, which I think, again, is not a unique story. It's very common.
So it's interesting. Before that, Jenny, the same thing. Her parents came here with one suitcase and not a word of English as well.
Yeah. And I think also as they worked harder and harder and managed to supply and give more and more to us children, me being the youngest of the three children, I was very lucky because when I was, for example, 12 years old, we had more than when my eldest brother, who's 7 years older, had at that same age. So I think I've always been in touch with the sacrifice that has allowed me to grow up in this amazing country, and then also the connection to the privilege as well. I'm the most privileged of the three siblings. So I think that connection of sacrifice and privilege, the combination, has really made me aware of being able to use that privilege to do something that can actually help other people. And of course, spending more time in Asia than in Australia as an adult, at least, that's really made me very aware of those points where choices were made, decisions were made that really affected the lives of their descendants that my ancestors made.
So you grew up in Australia. What did you do before you decided to go into Asia and lived in Asia?
My story starts when I was 5. So here I am, a 5-year-old boy growing up in typical suburban Australia in Sydney, in a place called Carlingford in the northwest. And on my first day in school, I was greeted by my teacher, Miss Pickering. And I remember this very clearly. She sat me down next to this boy whose name is Roger. And Roger...
Jim, the details.
Yeah, Roger, I think about this story quite a lot. Roger had very thick Coke bottle type glasses and he had to squint a lot to see properly, and there was always this little furrow between his eyebrows whenever he looked at anything and concentrated really hard. And Miss Pickering said on this first day in school, she said, I want you to help Roger because Roger can't see colours. So every time we pick a pencil out to do the colouring in, we need you to help him pick the right coloured pencil. And then she asked me at the end, she said, can you do that? Which I think is really interesting in reflection because she didn't say, you will do this. She said, can you? And that was a choice that I was able to make at that time. But of course, being an obedient 5-year-old boy, I said yes. And for the rest of the year, what we did was we did a lot of colouring in, as you do in kindergarten. And every time he needed a blue pencil, I'd pick out that one for him to colour the sky. Every time we were colouring the grass, I picked out a green pencil. So again, I was very lucky because at a young age, I learnt that not everybody was like me, and people do things differently, and sometimes all it takes is just a little bit of help to get them participating at the same level as us. Now, at that time, at the age of 5, I didn't know that word was disability. I didn't know what that word meant, but I was acutely aware that not everybody was the same as me. And then I went through school, again, very privileged upbringing, nothing too unusual about it. And I studied physiotherapy for 4 years. And then I came out of physiotherapy and I realized that it wasn't something I wanted to do when I grew up. So I left Australia and I actually went to Vietnam for 6 months.
Yep.
And I got to Vietnam and I did something that these days is frowned upon more and more, but at the time in 2006 was not a lot of awareness around this. And I volunteered in an orphanage. So people now know and starting to talk about the deleterious effects of orphanage volunteering. At that time, it wasn't really a well-known topic. And what happened was I was in this situation where I was trying to help. And there was a key moment, which is a typhoon came through the town, lifted the roof off this orphanage, and the dorms were so wet that the children had to sleep on the wooden classroom tables. And I felt very impacted by that emotionally and at the devastation that happened. But actually, the most predominant emotion I felt wasn't compassion or pity. It was actually helplessness. So I felt that I didn't know what I was doing there. In fact, I probably didn't really belong there. I hadn't even had a child protection check. No one had trained me to do anything to help these people. So I did what I could, but I left pretty soon after, feeling dissatisfied, I guess, at not being able to have the expertise to help well. And then I came back to Australia and I studied at university, international development, masters, and I thought, okay, great, I've got all this knowledge and ability to go out and help people in countries like Vietnam and China and so on. And I ended up in China working with an international organization where the conditions were really amazing. They flew me across, they gave me a driver, they gave me a translator, cook, cleaner, all of sort of amazing things. But what I found was that the impact that I had, again, was very minimal. And that's mostly because I think that there's a lot of problems around the way that we set up international charities and international development. A lot of it's self-serving, a lot of it's self-perpetuating. And here I was in that system that wasn't really working. So I left China very, very dissatisfied and quite jaded. And
what wasn't working for you? What did you find that you felt that I didn't have an impact? I mean, could you have impacted one life at least?
I'm sure we did impact one life, but I don't think that spend and the way that we talked about our work justified that minimal impact. I think the issue stems from, it's obviously very complicated, but it stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of what people in countries like Cambodia, Vietnam and China really want and really need. Because at the end of the day, we all have our biases. And even for someone who was born in Vietnam or perhaps born overseas, your bias is coloured by your experience living in another country. So there's a mismatch between what the donor wants to do and what the people really need. And in this example, often the donor is sitting in Europe, sitting in an office in Brussels or something like that, and they don't really understand what it is that people need. And I think also with international charities, there's a sense that this work just continues, keeps on going. It's more about addressing symptoms and solving problems. So you see these charities that are doing this work internationally over and over and over again, and they are making a difference, but I don't think they're actually solving problems. I think they're actually addressing symptoms.
Yep, I agree. So then you came back jaded. What did you reflect on? I mean, did you then say my purpose in working in international development, going to third world countries, it hasn't had that much of an impact from your perspective? What did you do next?
Yeah, it was pretty devastating because I'd spent, between 2006 to 2012 trying to find this answer. Where do I actually sit in this puzzle? And not just me, where do people like me who want to help, that are born into very privileged situations? How do we actually add value? And not finding that answer was very frustrating. So what I decided to do was to go to Cambodia. Now,
did you just look at the map and say, I'm going to go there?
No, it was a little bit more calculated than that, but not much more. The thing was, I didn't have a job at the time. So I thought to myself, I'm going to try and be in a place that the cost of living is quite low. So I'll be able to have a look around and see what's going on and not get paid and still survive. So I picked Cambodia. I didn't actually know anyone there, but I'd heard that there was a big need in terms of disability, which is most of my professional background. So when I got to Cambodia, I was put in touch with this Cambodian organisation and run fully by Cambodian people, 12 staff. And that experience really took me from being very jaded to being a believer again.
Right.
So what I saw was everything that I had hoped to see, which is real bottom-up grassroots development work. So they'd take me on the back of these motorbikes around Siem Reap, which is close to Angkor Wat, and they'd drive around for 70 kilometres a day, seeing children in the middle of nowhere, where there are no hospitals and no health centres. And I'd be sitting on the back at 35 degrees, scorching heat, inhaling dust, exhausted after one day. And these guys were doing it every day, day in, day out. And what they were able to do with very little funding is get these children with disabilities to become more independent. So the stories that I saw in that first year being in Cambodia really changed my life. I saw children that without this organisation would be left in the back room of the house, soiled, treated like animals really, no future, no possibility of going to school or ever getting a job. And that's very sad and very confronting, I think, to see it up close. But then when you see how they transform this person who is treated like an animal to become a human being with dignity that can contribute something to society, how can you not become a believer? How can you not turn that cynicism and jadedness around into wanting to do something about that and to support it?
I mean, how did you get them to show you that part of their work? I mean, here you are landed in Cambodia from Australia. They probably look at you, they think, oh, well, this guy is healthy, fit, and you didn't speak the language either.
No.
So how did you manage to make that connection?
Well, what I learned was that they didn't have all the answers. And that was also another interesting point to me, is that in that questioning about what can I offer, I started to become more aware of what it actually was. So what they lacked was technical knowledge was one thing. So my background as a physiotherapist, none of them had gone to university and trained. Now that's not to say that they didn't know what they were doing. They had a level of knowledge that obviously I didn't. So you mentioned language, cultural awareness, even understanding of disability as a whole, I would say far surpasses a lot of the physiotherapists that I've worked with in my career. So they had that sort of understanding, but they didn't have technical knowledge. And the other thing they didn't have was funding. So each of these staff that does this incredibly exhausting job was paid $200 a month. And to me, that's mind-blowing. When I think about how much money was spent on me as an expert flying into China for a year to do something that was not really that useful, and then to think about what about if we reallocated this money to local organisations so that they could do it for themselves. But I was put in touch with this organisation through contact of a contact, and that person identified that they needed this technical knowledge, which I was able to supply.
And so then once they've shown you around and you saw that aspect of, the disability population, you obviously had a
light bulb moment.
Yes, that's right. Epiphany.
Yeah.
What did you do next? You just decide to stay in Cambodia and not come back to Australia?
Well, the epiphany, that was one epiphany, but there was a bigger epiphany after that,
right,
which happened. It's another story to do with another kid, and 10-year-old boy whose name is Ling. Ling is a Cambodian child who has cerebral palsy, which is brain damage around the time of birth. And because of that, his movement's affected. So he could walk, but he couldn't run. He could ride a bicycle with some training, and therefore he was able to physically get himself to school. The problem was that his muscles were weak around his mouth, and they controlled his communication, and therefore he wasn't able to speak clearly. And people assumed because of that he was of low intellect. So again, this kind of child doesn't really have a future. He's not going to be able to go to school, earn money. The only way that he can contribute, if you could call it that, is by living a life of begging. And my colleagues knew that perhaps his intellect was fine, but his communication was affected. And so what we decided to do was to train one of them in very basic speech therapy. And this colleague, Pirom, worked with this boy Ling for months and months. And I come back to that village not long after, and I hear that Ling is going to school for the first time at the age of 12. And then a few months later, I return to that same village and I hear even better news, which is that Ling is not just attending, he's excelling. So Ling is now coming second in his class at the age of 12. So just think about that for a second. He has entered the school system 7 years after everyone else and leapfrogged the majority of his class to get near the top. And this epiphany, I think, was that speech therapy, which is something that I didn't know that much about, even though I'd worked with these clinicians before, can change a life, and that communication is fundamental and a basic human right to be able to achieve anything in life. But the next thing that I heard from my colleagues was that there are no Cambodian speech therapists at all. So the country has 0 Cambodian speech therapists trained at university. And again, that's a moment to pause and think about that for a second, because in a 1 or 2 kilometre radius of where we're sitting right now, there are more speech therapists than a country of 16 million people. Wow. So this realization really hit me like a ton of bricks. What also hit me as interesting was that I wasn't the only one, of course, to recognize that it was a problem. But I've had colleagues and people from UNICEF and WHO and these sort of big bodies and big organizations had identified the gap as well. But they weren't necessarily doing anything about it.
So then you were stuck. I mean, you realize that, and organizations realize that, but nobody is doing anything about it. What makes you think that you could be different?
Mainly stupidity, I'd say. I guess it's you get to a certain point where you start to realize that these things don't happen unless individuals want to get it going, and you're obviously someone who's well aware of that. And also that the struggle never ends. It's always still down to you to a certain extent, I think. So what I realised was there was an opportunity there to use that background that I'd had, my connection to the sacrifice and poverty perhaps, and then this privilege. And I think that's a really key part of this story, is that, yes, there are some qualities about me that meant that this was going to be successful, but the basic fundamental of all of this is privilege. Because if I had taken up this opportunity or decided to do something about it, start this organisation, and it had failed, then I just hop on a plane and come back to Australia and get a job. You know, there's a safety net there that exists that doesn't exist for other people. So I decided, okay, I'm going to try and do something about this and see where it goes. And as I mentioned, a lot of that is probably stupidity.
Well, so you, out of this, did you form that organisation around providing speech therapy then in Cambodia?
So yeah, I started with the end first. And I think I started with a couple of principles about this organisation being different, because I've already sort of mentioned a little bit about how organisations don't work, and I didn't want us to be another one of those. And Cambodia already has a lot of non-profit organisations. Anecdotally, I hear the second highest number in the world.
Wow.
So
as most developing countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, they do have a lot of international aid and international not-for-profit sector in there, supporting or helping a particular sector.
Yes. So I'm aware of that. Once you know that, the hypocrisy perhaps of starting your own organisation is just too glaring. But one of the principles was that this organisation had to close. The organisation that we started had to have an end point where we knew that we'd addressed a problem rather than addressing a symptom. And that exit point had to be very clearly defined. And I couldn't define it by myself at the beginning, so I had to wait a couple of years to actually get people to come along and join the team to help me to define it, which we now have. So that's one principle. Another principle was that the organisation had to be led by Cambodian people. So even though I started the organisation, I'm an outsider, I'm a foreigner. I've learnt to speak Cambodian Khmer reasonably well. In fact, I had to do an interview on TV in Cambodian at one point, which was more difficult than this one. And I understood the language and I understood the culture a little bit because I'd been there for 5 years, but I wasn't Cambodian. I wasn't born of that culture. I didn't understand the political system. So if we're talking about doing a job in Cambodia, this must be led by a Cambodian leader and Cambodian board. And I'm really proud to say that after 4 years, that became a reality. I handed off the leadership to a Cambodian lady who's now leading the organisation. This person has 15 plus years of experience in disability, and she's leading the organisation in a way that I couldn't, in a far better way, in a much more relevant way to the conditions in Cambodia.
How did you identify those leaders, though? Obviously, to run an organisation or to take the helm of, something that you've started,
Yep.
you've got to find somebody to actually really align with what you're doing, your values and all of that.
And I think that's very difficult, and just to highlight how difficult, because when you're a small organisation like OIC Cambodia, our organisation, you are competing with bigger organisations with bigger budgets. So when we try and recruit talent, they are being offered positions at the UN or with international organisations where their salaries are double, triple, quadruple. I've seen it all. So that makes it very challenging. And I think just to take one further step back, that's yet another way in which the international development system fails, because it's the international bodies with the biggest budgets that are poaching the local talent rather than allowing the local talent to work in organisations where they're directing traffic. Right. So in our situation, we have Cambodian people running our organisation who took pay cuts really to come and work with us, and that's, to me, astounding.
Absolutely, because they must believe in it so much and believe in what you are doing for them to take the pay cut.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think hiring on the basis of values rather than experience is one of the key things. So we really test out values.
But you managed to get the funding to actually employ people there, though.
We have always managed to pay people on time, with the exception of one person who often was not paid at all. But that's the sacrifice that you make as a founder. I think that we've done a pretty good job of that, but it's always been the hardest thing to be able to rustle up funding to support a cause that is not really well known.
Yeah, I mean, speech therapy in Cambodia, how did you manage to raise the funds for that? Because it's mainly either orphanages is often or sex trafficking, as you know. I mean, I've recently, I think a few months ago, I went to another fundraising here for another traffic kind of organisation that are rescuing young girls, young kids. But yeah, so how did you manage to, I suppose, get that issue to a point whereby you managed to get some funding?
The first year that I spent doing this in 2013 was a lot of talking to the bodies who, in my opinion, should be funding it. So your big UNICEF type bodies and your big international organisations. And repetitively, what I heard for a year was congratulations on finding something that's really important and quite logical and common sense that should be done. However, we can't support you because you don't work in our target area. Or if you're going to develop speech therapy, can you develop it for people with malaria? And I'm, of course, like, oh, that's not really how it works. I'm not doing something for 4% of 2% of the population. I'm doing it for 4% of 100% of the population. Yeah. So I learnt that we had to create our own streams of funding. That was pretty much it. And we started something called Day Without Speech. So in schools predominantly, and predominantly in Australia, we've set up this campaign where we get kids to give up talking for part of the day. And most people give the same facial expression you give, which is kids can give up talking.
Yeah,
but we have 4-year-olds lasting 45 minutes without talking.
Wow.
Which is incredible because I have a 4-year-old nephew who wouldn't last 2 minutes.
Yeah.
We have, older kids, of course, lasting the whole day. They experience what it's like to have a communication difficulty and that frustration that comes with it. And then they raise money, get sponsored to do so. And then we send in volunteers to debrief. And I think the debrief is really important because that cements the learning for the children, and it means they actually get something valuable out of it rather than just saying, please raise money for us, which is also valuable, but the learning aspect's really important too. And through this, we've managed to get it into a bunch of schools, and that's helped to raise at least half the budget, so about 100,000 plus through this initiative, and we're hoping to grow it year on year. So if there are any people watching that are in schools, workplaces as well, we've had Salesforce in San Francisco do it recently, have their staff give up talking. Day Without Speech is a really great opportunity to obviously support a charity, but also learn something really important. Di, you should also do it.
Yeah, I will. I'm going to think about how I'm going to start a day without talk, without speech.
You should do a podcast without speech.
Yeah, without speech for an hour, no speech. So, I mean, obviously you've identified that issue in Cambodia. What about in Australia, though? Do we have a similar, or not probably the same extent, but communication or speech condition? Does that impact people in Australia?
Yeah, well, I mean, think about what we're doing right now. So think about if you were unable to speak clearly or form the language in your brain, or every time I spoke, the processing of that language was difficult or challenging for you, how much that would impact your day-to-day. There's no reason to believe that the population that requires this therapy in Cambodia is any different to Australia. So typically we say 1 in 25, or over a lifetime, 1 in 8 people will require this therapy. The difference is in Australia, we have at least 10,000 speech therapists, whereas in Cambodia we have none. So the problem is the same over here. And when I handed off the leadership to OIC, which I mentioned to a Cambodian team, and I moved back to Australia last year. And then I realised, looking around this country, that there is that problem too, in terms of lack of therapists. Okay, not to that same level, but there is a problem that exists, but it only exists in one part of the country, and that's in the rural parts of Australia, where the clinicians don't have the infrastructure to work out there. And these people, clinics and hospitals are trying to recruit them for 18, 24 months, and they can't find people. And then I also realised that in the cities, we have an oversupply of these clinicians. So we have a lot of new grads who find it difficult to get jobs, a lot of young mums who would prefer to work from a home setting rather than a clinic. So with the new project that I'm working on, which is not related to the one in Cambodia, we just match the two together. It's a very simple model. We find the clinicians who want to work online to deliver the therapy online, and we match them with the children that are in rural parts of Australia who don't have access to this kind of therapy.
All right, so is that up and running?
It's pretty much up and running. It's been going since January.
Yeah.
We're about to take our first customers this week.
Right.
Fingers crossed.
It's individual customer, or is it or the departmental organisational customer when you talk about customer?
At the moment, we're subcontracting through other organisations until we can become stable enough to be independent and work with NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme. But we're in that process of getting that happening. And then what we're also doing is recruiting these clinicians, and their stories are really interesting. This is another interesting thing. When I started looking into this project Umbo with my two co-founders, I really had the children in the rural communities in mind, in my heart. What I've learned is the way in which we can impact clinicians is incredible. We have this lady at the moment who has a physical disability working with us, and it means that she can't sit in cars for a long time, and she can't stand for a lot of time, and she has to lie down because she gets a lot of severe lower back pain. And her current employer, which is the health department, isn't capable or interested in her working remotely. So when she saw us, she thought it fantastic. So we're giving her the opportunity to contribute to the workforce and provide this therapy to help these children where and when she wants to do it. You taking the breaks that she needs.
Yeah.
And I think that's really incredible. And she's one of quite a few.
I'm surprised the Department of Health is not providing that. I mean, especially the public service. Interesting. So this work that you do, now I know that your brother or one of your brothers is a doctor.
The successful one.
It's a successful one. What does the other brother do?
He's also a doctor. He's a PhD.
Yeah.
Completed his PhD, researcher.
Yeah. So what does your parents think of the journey or the path that you've taken? Is it kind of what they expect their younger son to be doing?
Certainly. Well, is it what they expected me to do? I think it's not the preferred approach, put it that way.
Yeah.
To put it diplomatically in an Asian family.
Yeah.
But I always say, and this is only a half joke, when your eldest brother, my eldest brother got 100 in the equivalent of ATAR, so HSC, when he finished school, and he went on to become a surgeon. So he's the golden child in an Asian family. So I think when your eldest brother does that, it gives the younger siblings a free pass to do whatever they like, because parents are like, we've done it already. These guys can do whatever they like. But I think that it took them a while to come around to this, to understanding it. And of course, when you leave a country that is not as privileged as Australia and you move here, and then your son goes back out to that country and lives in conditions that are, not less than ideal.
That's right.
For 8 years, you're going to feel a little bit conflicted by that.
Yeah.
But no, they've come around, and they're my biggest fans, biggest cheerleaders.
So when you came back here to Australia, you did mention that you initially went to look for work, and that process revealed something about, from your perspective, having worked in Cambodia and Asia, and you being of privileged background, thinking that coming back here would be great to find a job, but finding that you encounter what obviously some of us have identified as the bamboo ceiling. Can you share with us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because life throws stuff at you that it doesn't make sense at the time, but in retrospect it does. Because if I had found a job and slipped into that, I probably would have quit by now. And I wouldn't be starting this thing that I'm very passionate about, Umbo. But what I found was when I came back, despite having all this experience and having done a few things, impossible to get a job. So 15 plus applications over not very many months, and couldn't even get really interviews. So I maybe had 1 or 2 interviews. And these were jobs that I'd done before, perhaps in different settings. And the feedback that I got was, well, you haven't worked in Australia for a while, so you wouldn't be able to understand the system here, which I think is quite closed-minded, I think, because what that says, the subtext of that is that 8 years that you spent overseas and the 5 years you spent building up an organisation to then hand off and, have 15 staff, that's completely irrelevant in your CV. That would just white it out. So I found that very challenging. And then certain industries I think are harder to crack than others perhaps. So I did have an experience which is unfortunate, I think, where a law firm, I was applying for I actually wasn't even down to applying. I was inquiring about a job. So I'd sent a bunch of emails and I was unable to get a response. 3 different email addresses, different domains to check it wasn't a spam issue. Over 2.5 weeks, no response. And then I read this article which talked about an ANU study that says that people with Arabic and Asian names have to apply for a high percentage of jobs to be able to get an interview. It's 65% plus, I think. So I thought about this. I thought, let's just do a little experiment. So I created a fake Gmail account with a very, very Caucasian name.
What was that name?
Weh Yeoh. That's my Caucasian alter ego. And I sent off this email and got a response within 24 minutes. And it just hit me like a ton of bricks that, whether it's conscious or subconscious, I don't know. And I'm not here to pretend, but these are just the facts of what happened. And I think that's unfortunate. And I thought, I thought about me, but I also thought that I'm lucky because I've got obviously fluent English. I have a network here. If I'd pushed a little bit harder, I would have been able to get a job, of course. What about migrants? What about refugees? What about people who don't have those networks? And how much harder it must be for them? And I think in this whole situation, the people that miss out the most, that lose the most, is us, as in Australia. Because we're not bringing in these ideas from overseas because we're not even open to it. And this idea about you have to have done this exact job in Australia in this exact industry, we're just repeating the same stuff over and over again. And no wonder there's real lack of innovation here. And I say this to people sometimes that, I've been in Asia and I've travelled and looked at social enterprises, particularly, I guess, in other countries like Malaysia and Indonesia and Brunei and, obviously Cambodia and China. We are miles behind in Australia. We're miles behind, even Indonesia, this neighbour of ours. And they are doing things in a way that's much more advanced than Australia.
Right.
And that would surprise most people because I think in this country, people think a bit like they're in a bubble, that what we're doing here is really amazing. And it is. I'm not trying to downplay that. All I'm saying is that there are other countries, I think, that are integrating ideas from other places and therefore innovating a little bit quicker.
So how long have you been back now?
A bit over a year.
Bit over a year. So in that time frame, obviously you've had time. I mean, to do your startup with Umbo, obviously engaging, interacting with many organisations and people. What you've just touched upon it in terms of the innovation piece. Is people are kind of stuck in this bubble. So what is Australia missing, do you think? I mean, other than having not that open mind, what is it about us? I mean, we are a lucky country, aren't we, after all?
Well, I wonder if that's part of the problem. The cynical, easy answer would be, particularly in Sydney, we've got the harbour, we've got the beaches, why would we bother doing anything else? So I think that there's a certain perhaps lack of hunger there, whereas, of course, if you go to a lot of other countries in the world that don't have these very comfortable lifestyles, they're a bit more hungry to do and to innovate, to think. And this country, by the way, Australia, is traditionally one of the most inventive countries, of course. If you think about all the inventions, the black box, red light cameras, Wi-Fi invented in this country. So it's interesting, I think, historically that that's been the case, but at the moment, I'm not sure if it is or not. I probably don't really know. But I think there is a bit of a blinkered approach to what happens here in Australia is the world to a certain extent. And you see that a lot in non-profits as well. You see that a lot of foundations. We only support Australian causes. The attitude that I had, you haven't worked in Australia, that's a recruitment issue. So I think there's a bit of a sort of a blindness to what's out there. And again, going back to Indonesia, our biggest neighbour, and probably in some senses our most important neighbour in many ways, huge country, the number of people learning Indonesian, I heard the other day, is actually decreasing.
Yeah.
It's gone down since the 90s, I believe.
Yep, that's right.
It's madness. I don't really understand why that is.
What have you discovered, say, with Indonesia, that they were doing that you think could Australia be ahead in that, but we're not?
Even when you think about technology, right? So a lot of these countries like Indonesia, they skipped a level of technology. We have landlines here everywhere. Most of these countries in Asia, they don't use landlines. So I think what that is, it's a blank slate approach. So you're coming at an idea with completely fresh eyes and you're not worried about this legacy. And Australia, of course, is not an old country. It's only a few hundred years old. Yeah. But we have some legacy in terms of thinking that's the way it has been / should always be. At OIC in Cambodia, we came up with this document called a cultural manifesto. And it's basically a document that says how we do what we do. So these are the principles that guide this organisation. And one of the lines in there is, we, as in the team, we will never use that's how it's always done or that's how it's always been as justification for anything. Right? So if someone says that in a meeting or any kind of discussion, you go, point it out.
Yeah.
And I would love that to be the approach that we take to solving a lot of problems in this country or just generally. Well, why does it have to be that way?
Yeah, I think there is. I find that with big institutions, there that fear that of if you do something that you don't normally do, it can somehow disrupt the system, and people prefer to play the same, operate the same way, have the same model. I think that's probably where Australian organisations are kind of behind because of that mentality. And
in general, the status quo exists and perpetuates by the people who are in a position to benefit from that. So I think it's really that simple, that when you look at any situation and someone's saying, no, we shouldn't change it, have a look at why they have that interest. What's their vested interest in the status quo being the same?
What drives you? I mean, I see you on LinkedIn in particular, calling out in terms of the the work of the not-for-profit, in particular, identifying I think a few weeks ago, posting a photo of, of obviously very Western people in a third world country, saying something has to change. First of all, why are you so passionate about that?
Well, as I started with my journey towards working out, and I obviously don't have the answer yet, but still working out how do I, as a privileged Westerner, help, has been 12 years long. So I'm still working on that answer. And in that situation in Cambodia, I took myself out of that position of power as the leader because I realised that I'm not the best person to do it. So you could imagine that it's quite grating to see Westerners who think they have all the answers flying into a country that they've never been to save other people. And I think that really harps back to a little bit about why do we have this impulse to save people in other countries, which is a good impulse to have. I think it's a good impulse to want to help people. I think that when you see a problem, let's say, for example, a child who's starving or has a physical disability but doesn't have the help, you feel some kind of emotional connection, and that's what makes you human. And then hopefully at some point you take an action. A lot of people obviously don't. They see it and they're paralyzed and they don't take action. But in between those two moments of emotion and action, that's when the most important stuff happens. That's when you think about, okay, how do I actually help best? What can I do? And then also, I would argue, when am I going to stop helping? But a lot of non-profits and a lot of people and volunteers who travel overseas, voluntourists we call them, they never really get to that stage of that rational thought about how does this action of mine impact in the big picture? And is it perhaps perpetuating or harming? So we talked about we talked about orphanages before. 70% of children in Nepal and Cambodia who are in orphanages actually aren't orphans. They have parents. So what we're doing is we're sending volunteers to these orphanages to help, but we're also keeping them away from their families. We're also growing them up in environments that are bad for their emotional and mental development. So the parents are putting them there because they see a physical environment that's better, but in terms of everything else that's non-physical, it's worse. So the more progressive non-profits are actually working towards putting these orphans, inverted commas, back into their families.
But then that comes down to the parents of, in this situation, say, be it Cambodia or anywhere else, is those parents, how do you then, whether or not you're a Westerner or not, educate these people that this is not the path, for your child to be educated or get access to the resources that you think that they need? Really, can you really blame the Westerner for coming? Because they probably think, oh, well, there are so many orphans that we want to save them. On the other hand, their parents would say, look, that's where a lot of my kids can get three times a day fed and education. So they're operating quite separately, aren't they? So can you really, blame the Westerners or the volunteers, the volunteerists who come in there to try to do their bit to do good?
I think it's a good question. I think it's obviously two-sided, so we need to work on both sides. But while there are volunteerists going in and funding and supplying this, because of course that's part of your contribution, that model will never end. And I talked about when I did it in 2006. It's 12 years on. People are still doing the same stuff. And I'm not certainly claiming that, I'm not responsible for my own mistakes. That's clearly a mistake as well. But we've moved on from there. I think the key question to all of this, though, is to think about what would I want for my own child, or what would I want for this country? And obviously, you look around Australia, we don't have orphanages here. We don't do that anymore because we know that it doesn't work. You wouldn't be able to, as a adult, waltz into any preschool or foster home and just start playing with kids. So why should it be different in another country? And I think that's where... I
hadn't thought of that.
And I think that's where, coming back to an earlier question about how do we help, it's really got to come down to a lot of empathy and also thinking about our dreams versus other people's dreams. Because the problem with us, anyone, is our inability to really empathise for someone else. We try, but we can't really. So our dreams for what is good for them, for what it constitutes a good life for other people, often shrinks down their dreams. And this is one example. So, it's I'll give you another example. Let's ship across used books from a library to Cambodia because they don't have a lot of English books there.
Yeah.
And then you think about that and you go, okay, these are used books. Conditions probably not that great. Language potentially an issue. But also, aren't there local suppliers of books? There's a very good stat, not to do with books. It's around clothing.
Yeah.
You heard this one?
No, I haven't heard, but I know about the clothing part that's being, you collect the secondhand clothes and
Ship them across.
ship them across.
So the statistic is, and I'll forgive me because I can't remember the exact countries, but they're in Africa and I think South America. And the time period is roughly 1981 to 1995, roughly. And the statistic is that used clothing imports, which were given as donations, well-meaning of course, they basically ruined the local industry for clothes, textile industry.
Right.
And they decreased
Wow.
employment by over 50%. I think it was about 60% roughly. They decreased production by about 45%.
Wow.
Of course, how can you compete? Let's say you're Vietnam. I dump used clothing in there to give out for free. How can a local manufacturer compete? So in our desire to help, we often cause more harm than we do good. And that comes back to that question then about what happens between that emotion and action. Have we really thought about the consequences of what we're doing?
Isn't there a saying, the road, the good intention is paved with...
The road to hell is paved with good
Yeah,
intentions.
the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So, yeah, it hadn't even occurred to me that, that impacts on the local economy of that country. Say, for instance, with clothes, if you donate. But as somebody who wants to donate, you think, oh, well, it's they don't have the money to buy.
Yes.
So if we donate to them, it saves them the money.
Yeah.
Isn't that a logical way to think?
That's the logical way. It's a logical impulse as opposed to the rational explanation once we have time to think and explain, but of course, I'm not blaming anybody for not knowing these facts.
No, but it's an interesting, just you brought it up, I'm just thinking, oh my God, okay. Nobody stopped to think about that.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the thing is that, it really comes down to people, I think, who should be talking about this issue. In other words, the non-profits. But what I find generally, this is a huge generalization, but a lot of non-profits don't want to impart knowledge that they know. What they want to do is, in fact, pander to the lowest common denominator method of raising money. So there's another phrase, poverty porn, which you might be familiar with.
No.
Okay. Poverty porn is basically the idea that we use pictures of starving children and flies to try and attract money because it works. The problem is that it is very harmful because for a lot of different reasons, but for me, the most important one is it sends the wrong message. It sends the message that people in other countries are grateful recipients of our help as opposed to, obviously in the example that I've used in Cambodia, active participants in solving their own problems. And therefore, the work that we do for them will always be paternalistic and always be, you should be thankful for the fact that we're giving you secondhand stuff that we don't want.
But let's go to that. I mean, I remember years and years ago, the image of African child, malnourished. I think perhaps the not-for-profit sector have learned something because you don't see that much, that many photos advertised as regularly on television as they used to. I remember.
It's been banned, actually.
Right.
It's been banned by a body called ACFID, which is the Australian Council for International Development. So in their statement, they say they must be portrayed with a sense of dignity. However, you're right, it's much less common, but it's making a comeback. I've seen it on TV a number of times. I won't state which organisation, but it's making a comeback because organisations, I think, are desperate. So they're coming back to this lowest common denominator stuff. But what's unfortunate is that we have, I studied at uni to do this and we work in this sector. We should be imparting our knowledge to empower donors and the general public to give in ways that are ethical and appropriate and that work. Not doing things because we're like, we're desperate for money. And part of it is, I think, coming back to that question about why are we doing this again? Yeah. What's the point?
Yep.
In China with that organisation I worked with, the point, I believe, was to perpetuate the existence of this organisation in China. not to actually perhaps deliver some kind of tangible benefit and then get out. It's to keep us moving.
So what's your purpose then? What's
To do stuff and get out. I'm really interested in... Someone once said to me that people who work in non-profits and perhaps founders and journalists are very similar because we both seek the truth.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually very telling, that we're looking for the truth even if we never find it. And for me, the truth is, how do we impact the most people in the appropriate manner and doing it the right way and doing it in a way that they're active participants in this? And I think that's really a difficult problem to try and solve. So in me finding this or looking for this answer, of course, you would hope that the work that we're doing is impacting people anyway. But initially, when I started this organisation, Cambodia, OIC, I had a lot of contact with the families and the children because I obviously needed to see what the problem was. Increasingly, as time went on, there became layers between me and those people. So it wasn't anymore that emotional connection to empathise with their story that drove me day to day. And I think that's a bit of a common scenario.
Yeah, but realistically, can you, as an organisation grow, one. Secondly, as you deal with more and more of these people, really, how much can you as a human person can take from that emotional engagement? Because it can take an emotional toll on your own being, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
So I think that having that layer is eventually for the growth of the organisation, but also for you to also, I think anyway, it's as you said, it's that search for the truth. Is that truth? What's the best way to run a business, to run an organisation, to be as idealistic as possible, to be to the truth, to the core of it as possible? But really, do you think we could end up the same way that, that we criticise others for? Could we build an organisation? For me, I want inclusion and diversity. I want to ensure that people with different perspectives and ideas are heard, and that I, being a founder, will constantly stay connected to these people, and that there's a flat structure. But can there be a flat structure? Because at the end of the day, there has to be somebody to lead it, somebody who will have to run the operation, somebody to actually execute it. So there's different layers.
Yeah. What you're talking about, if I understand correctly, is you're grappling with the doubt.
Yeah. Right? Well, of course.
Yeah. So that's.
So don't you doubt?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. It's one of my favourite quotes. Voltaire said, "Doubt is not a pleasant condition, but absolute certainty is madness." And I think what you have just described in your own sense of doubt is very encouraging, and it's a sign that you're not full of hot air.
Oh, I suppose, yeah. I hadn't thought of that, but sometimes you doubt. You think, oh, I hope that you don't get to, as you said, you don't want to get to the position whereby you're living and behaving and thinking the same as the people, or as those that you're saying shouldn't go down that path.
But that sort of sense of doubt on this topic of inclusion and diversity, I find is generally more common in women, and I think it's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. And I think men run a little bit more on bravado and testosterone, and I'm not saying men are useless, but you need a combination of both. And I think I lean more heavily towards that doubt and the fact that women are grounded in reality. So it may be a coincidence, I don't know, but most of the people that I work with are female. Both my successor in Cambodia is female, another head of staff over there is female, most of the team is female. Of course, I work with allied health professionals, they're mostly female. And what I find is that women are a little bit better, I think, at asking questions that ground the work that you're doing in reality, where often men, and maybe I'm a bit different, I'm not sure, but for me at least, my head's a little bit in the sky. I'm thinking a little bit about big picture stuff.
Yep.
I'm saying we should do this, we need to do this. And then at some point, someone will ask, well, how are we going to do it? And that person is usually female. And I'll be like, I'm not sure. That's when you guys come in and work it out.
Yeah.
So I think that's really just one of the benefits of being female and surrounding yourself with females is that they grapple with doubt a lot better, and that's really important.
But then on the other hand, I mean, the health sector in particular is quite mainly a lot of female in that sector than men. But if you go down to, if you talk about diversity and inclusion, wouldn't you, do you think that if there are more men in that sector, I don't know, there'll be different perspectives on how to do things differently? I don't know.
I think so. Yeah, I think you need to have both. I'll give you an example. When I worked as a physiotherapist in a hospital early on, I was in a department of about 45 physiotherapists, of which maybe 5 were male, roughly.
Jeez.
And that's not uncommon in the public sector. The unfortunate thing was that the heads of department behaved in a way that almost excluded the men. They deliberately, I don't know if they deliberately or not, but they made men not feel welcome, which is madness, because if you're in that scenario, you want to include other people that can bring different perspectives, regardless of whether they're male or female. Obviously, in most scenarios in the workforce, it's the opposite situation. Like, you think of banking and law and engineering and so on. They're generally male-dominated sectors. Yeah. So I think, you've always got to work really hard to try and find those perspectives that are different.
Yeah, but you also have to work. I just listening to what you just shared, I'm thinking, oh gosh, while I believe I champion and advocate for inclusion, I also, the other day there was this piece on Australia Post on LinkedIn, and it's great. Christine Holgate, who is a champion of gender in leadership, but it's a picture of amazing, great women. For me, that's not inclusive, because I think I'm sure there are men in leadership positions that should be, who's supportive of the ideas that she's trying to champion. So inclusion is not just about race as well. For me, inclusion is about to have that male perspective or have another perspective that could be different to yours, which I think, going back to what the health scenario that you described, how there's only 5 male physiotherapists and the rest are female, and yet the leader of that organisation doesn't see the importance of including more. So
it shouldn't matter what that group is, as long as the opinions are diverse.
Yeah.
But I think this is interesting, right? Because it comes back to what we were just talking about with doubt, is that when you start to really make space for all of these different opinions that are often challenging and different to yours, that's hard. It'd be much easier if I just got 5, yes men or 5 Wehs equivalents to come and work with me, because we just get stuff done much quicker.
Yeah.
But then, are we doing the right thing? That's the question, right? So are we actually doing the thing that's relevant? And going back to my experience in Cambodia, as the leader of the organisation, as the founder, there's a few things that I've got going for me. So I'm the founder, I'm male, I'm tall in Cambodia. I have all of these reasons why people should listen to me and do in that setting, in a team environment. So to make decisions, it's very easy. Just go bang, 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 bang. And I can lead the team very confidently, obviously, because I've done it for a while. But the question is, where am I leading that team to? I think that's a really important part. And maybe I'm leading them to the wrong place. And that's why, right from the beginning, I was very clear that it had to be a Cambodian leader to lead them in the right direction. Now, that leadership transition from the original founder to then a new person coming in is still going. I'd say we're still in that transition period, a year and a bit later. It takes a long time. It would take easily 1.5 years, 2 years, I think, to feel like that person has the stamp of authority. So is that, it would be easier in the short term to not even bother with that, I think, and just keep me in position, which is why I think a lot of founders stick around for a long time. It's harder to do the leadership transition piece, but it means perhaps that the work that you do is more relevant, more meaningful.
So where to next for you? What's on the horizon?
I'm in Australia now, full-time, give or take. Umbo is becoming an increasingly interesting part of my life and taking up more time. So Umbo is structured slightly differently to OIC. It's a social enterprise as opposed to non-profit, and it's still trying to solve a social benefit, but it's set up currently as a business, although we are looking at starting a charity to work with it as well, perhaps. And trying to solve that problem in rural Australia is really important and also a stepping stone perhaps to try and solve this problem elsewhere. I would love this platform to be good enough so that, for example, a clinician in Cabramatta could do the therapy for a kid in Vietnam. We'd love to be able to get to that level. So we've got big ambitions and dreams for that, and it's going to take a lot of time. I think also being here now, having had the experience, I've got one or two things to say about how we interact with countries like Cambodia. And a couple of weeks ago, I did a TEDx talk at TEDx Haymarket, and the topic is why international charities need to make themselves redundant. So I'm really interested in this idea about how do we address problems rather than just fixing symptoms. And how do we start things, sure, that are necessary and fund them and work in that area, but then get out of the way so that local people can take it on. And the idea, I believe, is that redundancy is the ultimate form of success.
Absolutely. For me, I think that the day that dawn doesn't exist is when we
Doesn't need to exist
anymore. Then that I think we will see the leadership across our mainstream institutions are really diverse and inclusive. We don't need to call it out. We don't need to have a conversation because it's already in the DNA, in the culture, embedded in people's mindset and the way that they work and operate. So absolutely.
How do we know that will happen?
I don't know yet. I think when organisations stop reaching out to us, but then they'll probably reach out to another, what do you call a fad? There'll be another fad.
Flavour of the month.
Flavour of the month, perhaps. I hope not, but yeah.
I think this is interesting, and it goes much beyond even non-profits or social causes. So I've been thinking about in the private sector how CEOs are paid bonuses for getting good profits in the short term, but often the way in which they get those profits can perhaps be detrimental to the company in the long run. So wouldn't it be great to have a CEO being paid a bonus after a certain period of time, after they finish? So we set KPIs for 5 years after you finish your tenure as CEO, and then if you hit those KPIs are running in your absence, then we'll reward you. Same in the political sphere. We have new prime ministers all the time. We have a new one at the moment who was asked by a journalist at a press conference something along the lines of, "What have you contributed in the last few weeks?" Yeah. He's been there a few weeks. I just think that's really, it's very difficult to show those kind of results.
Exactly, yeah.
So how can we incentivize politicians to think longer term rather than short term? And it's the same with non-profits. It's just trying to stretch out that vision so that we're not looking at the immediate short-term stuff, which often can be harmful in the long run.
Thank you.
Thanks, Di.
That's great. Well, did you enjoy that episode of Dawncast? Well, I hope you did. At Dawn, the difference is you. So hit the subscribe button below and leave a comment and tell us what you would like to hear more of in the future.